Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the complicated and, honestly, kind of hilarious family dynamics of Zeus, the king of the gods. Yeah, the guy who literally controls lightning and thunder, but also somehow manages to make the most awkward decisions in his relationships. If you've ever wondered why the ancient Greeks thought the gods were, well, kind of a hot mess, you're in for a treat. We'll see how a guy with infinite power couldn't quite avoid making the same mistakes over and over again, especially when it came to family. You might even start to feel a little better about your own family after this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, if you like ancient Greek drama with a side of family dysfunction, we'll probably get along just fine. Drop a comment too. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fun to know what time zone I'm sending you off to sleep from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Zeus wasn't just your run-of-the-mill Greek god. Sure, he had the power to cool down thunderstorms, control the sky, and strike down anyone who dared challenge him. But when it came to family matters, let's just say, the guy could have used a little guidance. Picture this. You're the head of an entire pantheon of gods, but you still can't figure out how not to ruin every family gathering. That was Zeus. But where did it all start? Well, we've got to go back to his first impression as a father. You'd think that being the son of the terrifying Titan Kronos would give you some kind of blueprint on how to parent. After all, Kronos wasn't exactly known for being warm and fuzzy. He ate his own children. Yeah, you heard meet them. Lovely, right? But Zeus, when he finally became the big man in charge, tried to break free from that cycle. However, the truth is, even though he had this new authority, he didn't quite escape the family drama that ran deep in his bloodline. Imagine you're Zeus for a second. You've overthrown your father, Kronos, and now you're king of the gods, and you're faced with the overwhelming responsibility of trying to raise your own family. No pressure, right? But here's the catch. Your first big test as a parent is trying to raise children who, let's face it, will probably be just as messed up as you are. One of your first kids? Athena. You swallow her mother, Metis, whole. Yes, whole. Because you were told she'd bear a son who might dethrone you. You can't risk that. But plot twist. You later have Athena spring out of your head. Not only is that a totally weird story for her to hear at family gatherings, but it also means that your own actions created a seriously complicated relationship with your firstborn. But, oh, it doesn't stop there. Zeus wasn't content with just one chaotic moment. His relationships, especially with his family, were always complicated to say the least. Take his relationship with Hera, for instance. They were married, of course, but their relationship could probably fill volumes. It's the kind of family dynamic that you might find on a reality TV show, if ancient Greece had one. The drama was intense, and the ups and downs were anything but normal. Despite their constant bickering, Zeus and Hera would later become the quintessential power couple of the gods. But, let's be real, constant bickering is an understatement. Hera had to put up with a lot, considering Zeus had this awful habit of not exactly sticking to one partner, or two, or, well, you get the idea. And speaking of one partner, let's talk about Zeus's tendency to stray. This is where things get truly, truly chaotic. You see, while Hera was, shall we say, the primary goddess in his life, Zeus's romantic side projects were as legendary as his thunderbolts. His romantic escapades, well, let's say they involved transforming into all kinds of animals. You've got Zeus as a swan, a bull, a golden shower of light. Yes, golden shower. No, not that kind, thankfully. But still, not exactly something you'd want to explain to the neighbors, right? So, you can imagine how this played out with his children. How would you feel if your father, who's supposed to be this mighty, all-powerful figure, was out there having kids with every possible creature on the planet? Oh look, Dad's a golden shower again. Great. Not quite the family portrait we're used to, right? But this complicated family life didn't stop with just his romantic ventures. Zeus's children, especially his daughters, were affected by all this chaos. Take Athena, for example. She came from his head, and we all know how that conversation went. Or look at Apollo, and Artemistwo, more of his kids who were somewhat neglected, yet still managed to be absolutely legendary in their own right. In fact, some might say that the way Zeus interacted with his children actually set the stage for a whole bunch of future family drama. Oh, and the family issues didn't end with just him and Hera. Every god, goddess, and mortal he touched seemed to end up with a massive emotional scar of some sort. Like, hey, don't worry about being the god of love, we'll make you suffer just the same. By now, you're probably starting to see why Zeus's family wasn't exactly a Norman Rockwell painting. It was more like an eternal soap opera, but with lightning bolts instead of dramatic pauses. But don't worry, this was just the first chapter in the ongoing saga of why Zeus couldn't ever quite escape the family drama that followed him everywhere. So, we've established that Zeus didn't have the easiest time as a father, but how about his marriage to Hera? Ah yes, the queen of the gods. You would think that being the powerful, respected god she was, Hera would get the respect and loyalty she deserved. But nope, Zeus was, as we've seen, not exactly the model husband. To put it simply, their relationship was about as rocky as Mount Olympus itself, with enough drama to fill an entire Greek tragedy. Let's dive into their marriage, shall we? Imagine being Hera. You're a goddess with everything beauty, power, status, and then you find out that your husband has been cheating on you with pretty much anything that moves. And, while you'd think being the king of the gods would make Zeus more accountable, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Zeus had this bizarre notion that as long as he was the almighty king, he could do whatever he wanted. And trust me, he did. But Hera wasn't exactly the type to just sit back and accept it. Oh no, Hera had plans. While Zeus was out there turning into swans, bulls, and golden showers, yes, golden showers, still weird, Hera was plotting her revenge. You'd think she'd just divorce him, right? I mean, who could blame her? But Hera didn't exactly take the easy route. Instead, she engaged in this full-blown game of divine revenge that would make even the most complex family dramas look simple. For instance, you know the story of Io, right? Poor Io was just a priestess in Argos, minding her own business when Zeus came along, again in disguise, this time as a cloud. He, of course, fell for her, and as expected, that led to a classic Zeus escapade. Hera, not one to let things slide, quickly figured out what was going on and turned Io into a cow. Not just any cow, though, no. This one was special. Hera made sure that Io would be watched by Argus, a monster with 100 eyes. One would always be awake, making it impossible for Io to escape. Goddess-level petty. Am I right? But it wasn't just her enemies that Hera had it out for. She took out her frustrations on Zeus's lovers, and children too. This divine drama was not just about keeping Zeus in check, it was about creating endless chaos wherever she could. When you think about it, Hera probably could have used a good therapist, or at least a vacation. As for Zeus, it's not like he was blind to all of this. In fact, he was well aware that Hera wasn't going to sit idly by while he did whatever he pleased. But instead of calming things down, Zeus seemed to just keep fanning the flames. If you've ever been in a situation where you accidentally made things worse by trying to make them better, you'll relate to Zeus's approach. Every time he tried to smooth things over with a gift or a dramatic apology, it only seemed to make things more complicated. One of the most memorable moments of their marriage was the story of the Trojan War. You'd think that with all the power Zeus had, he could just step in and end the conflict before it began. But no, Zeus, for reasons only a Greek god could understand, allowed his children to be directly involved in the war. His son, Aeneas, was a Trojan hero, and his other kids, well, let's just say they were spread out across both sides of the battlefield. The result? A godly mess of divine intervention, family loyalties, and of course, a 10-year-long war. You've got to wonder, was Zeus trying to help his family? Or was he just trying to keep everyone in check by watching them go through a divine game of survival? Either way, it's a fascinating glimpse into how far Zeus was willing to go to keep his family in the limelight, even if it meant endless chaos. And then there's the great irony. Despite all this mess, at the end of the day, Hera and Zeus remained together. It's like those couples who can't seem to stop fighting but can't imagine life without each other either. Sure, Zeus was still out there with his various lovers, and sure, Hera was still plotting her revenge, but their dysfunctional bond endured. In the end, their relationship was a perfect reflection of the gods themselves, a chaotic, unpredictable force of nature that could never truly be understood, but always seemed to keep going. But this wasn't just about Zeus and Herathis. It was the pattern that played out again and again in Zeus's family life. His children inherited this mix of power, loyalty, jealousy, and, yes, a lot of drama. While Zeus was trying to maintain control over the godly realm, his family members seemed more interested in maintaining their own slice of power, which, let's be honest, never made things easy. And so the story of Zeus and his family is not just about gods doing godly things. It's about an entire family caught in a whirlwind of affection, resentment, loyalty, and betrayal. Because, when you get right down to it, even gods have some serious family issues to work through. And as much as you'd think these gods were above all that, well, they really weren't. Zeus might have been king of the gods, but when it came to family, he wasn't much different from anyone else. He just happened to have a lot more lightning bolts at his disposal. Now that we've covered the whole Hera and Zeus drama, let's move on to another aspect of Zeus's family that you might find even more entertaining. Remember how we mentioned Zeus had a lot of kids? And no, we're not talking about the normal kind of kids, the kind you bring to the grocery store or take to soccer practice. Zeus's kids were gods and goddesses. Some were born in weird ways. Some had very complicated relationships with their father, and some were downright terrifying in their own right. So, let's kick things off with Athena. Athena is one of Zeus's most famous children, and her origin story is as strange as anything in Greek mythology. If you ever wondered what it would be like to literally pop out of your dad's head, then Athena's your girl. You see, Zeus got a bit paranoid. He was told that the child Metis, a Titaness who was Zeus's first wife, was going to have a son who would eventually overthrow him. Classic Zeus, right? Rather than just, talk to his wife or maybe consider some therapy, he decided the best course of action was to swallow Metis whole. He must have thought, problem solved. No son will overthrow me. But, as we know from any Greek myth, things rarely go as planned. Instead of just carrying on with life, Zeus started suffering from an epic headache. And no, this wasn't your typical headache after a late-night feast kind of headache. This was an otherworldly, godly level of pain that made Zeus pretty much lose his mind. So, what does he do? Well, he calls upon Hephaestus, the god of blacksmithing, to chop open his head with an axe, and out comes Athena, fully grown, armoured, and ready for battle. Imagine the look on everyone's faces when a fully armed warrior goddess just springs out of Zeus's head. It's like if your dad got a headache one day and suddenly out pops a superhero. Athena, with her wisdom and strategic mind, became one of the most important figures in Greek mythology. But let's not forget how completely absurd her birth story is. I mean, it's not every day that someone's dad gives birth to them. Athena was practically a walking contradiction, a goddess of wisdom born from a giant headache. But this isn't the only weird parenting move Zeus made. Let's talk about Apollo and Artemis, two of Zeus's most famous children. These two are interesting because they really took after their father in some ways, namely, their godly powers. Apollo became the god of the sun, music, and prophecy, while Artemis was the goddess of the moon, hunting, and virginity. But here's the kicker. Their mother, Leto, was pretty much chased all over the place by Hera when she was pregnant. Hera, still sore over Zeus's infidelities, didn't want Leto to give birth anywhere, so she made it almost impossible for her to find a place to rest. But, as expected, Leto eventually found an island where she gave birth to Apollo and Artemis. You've got to admire Leto for not just giving up. I mean, here she is, carrying twins while being chased around the world by a vengeful queen. And then Zeus, instead of stepping in to help out his wife, didn't. As usual, Zeus was too busy with his own affairs, which meant his children had to deal with Hera's wrath by themselves. And yet, despite all of this, Apollo and Artemis turned out to be two of the most powerful and respected gods in the pantheon. So, what's the takeaway here? Well, for starters, you've got to give Zeus credit where credit's due. Managed to create some really incredible gods, even if his parenting was, shall we say, less than ideal. He wasn't exactly the father who sat down for heart-to-heart talks with his kids. but he did provide them with some of the most godly and legendary abilities in Greek mythology. The thing is, Zeus's parenting style was more about giving his kids the tools to survive the chaos, rather than guiding them through it. They were born into a world of divine turmoil, and if they were going to make it, they had to do it on their own terms. And that brings us to a very interesting point. Zeus's children were, in many ways, a reflection of their environment. They didn't have the nurturing parent figures that many might hope for. Instead, they had a father who ruled the skies with thunderbolts, and a mother who was constantly waging war on his infidelities. The gods of Mount Olympus were born into a world of war, betrayal, and power struggles. If you were one of Zeus's children, you quickly learned that if you wanted to get ahead in this family, you had to fight for it. But, even though Zeus might not have been the most present or emotionally available father, he did leave a legacy behind. His children went on to become some of the most well-known gods and goddesses, each playing a crucial role in shaping the world as the Greeks saw it. So, despite all of Zeus's mistakes, he did manage to create a family that, in the end, could hold its own in the chaotic world of the gods. And just when you think the story couldn't get any more bizarre, it does. But that's a tale for another time. Alright, we've covered the chaos of Zeus's marriage to Hera and the peculiar birth stories of his children, but now we need to take a step back and examine a much bigger theme in Zeus's life: his remarkably strange relationship with power and control. It's not that Zeus was incapable of making decisions, but when you're the king of the gods, everything tends to get a little out of hand. So let's look at Zeus's role as the supreme ruler of Mount Olympus. Now, you might think that being the king of all gods means you've got everything under control, that you call the shots and everyone listens to you. But if you've been following along, you'll know that Zeus had a bit of a blind spot when it came to keeping his family in line. Power, it seems, wasn't just a tool for Zeus, it was more of a weapon. And that's where things get really messy. Let's start with one of the most fascinating aspects of Zeus's reign: his ability to manipulate people and gods alike to maintain his rule. Sure, he had his thunderbolt, but Zeus wasn't always swinging it around like a child in a toy store. No, he preferred to use his charm. Yes, you heard me right. Zeus was, in fact, the king of persuasion. Whether it was charming a mortal woman into his arms, or convincing a fellow god to go along with his plans, Zeus was all about talking his way out of situations. This is where his affairs come into play again. Let's just say, if you were one of Zeus's mistresses, you were more than likely completely convinced that he was the one, whether he was turning into a swan to seduce Leda, or transforming into a bull to woo Europa. Zeus had a way of making every woman he encountered think she was the most special one in his life. Classic Zeus move. But what about his other children, the ones born from his affairs? These children weren't exactly raised in the warm, fuzzy embrace of a loving father. Instead, they were often brought into the world through deception, manipulation, and sometimes outright violence. Just ask Perseus, one of Zeus's more famous sons. Perseus was born after Zeus visited the mortal princess Danae in the form of a golden shower. Yes, again, Zeus used his famous golden light to impregnate her. To make matters even more dramatic, Danae's father, King Acrisius, was told that his grandson would kill him, so he locked Danae and her newborn child in a chest and threw them into the sea. Perseus, however, would later fulfill his destiny by slaying Medusa and using her head to help defeat the mighty Kraken. It's a classic bad start, good finish story, but you've got to wonder how much of Perseus's success was his own, and how much was because of that rather odd golden beginning. While it's easy to focus on the bizarre nature of Zeus's affairs, there's a much more complicated dynamic at play here. You see, by having all these children and spreading his divine influence, Zeus was, in a sense, creating his own power base. Each child, each demigod, was a potential ally or threat to Zeus's reign. This might sound a little Machiavellian, but hey, when you're at the top of the divine hierarchy, a little power play isn't unheard of. Take Heracles, for example. Heracles, Hercules as the Romans later called him, was one of Zeus's most famous mortal sons. He was a huge deal in Greek mythology, known for his strength and for completing the legendary 12 labors. But you know what? Heracles wasn't exactly treated like the golden child. Despite being Zeus's son, Hera had a massive vendetta against him. She made his life miserable from the moment he was born. Hera even drove him to madness at one point, causing him to kill his wife and children in a tragic accident. Now, if you're Zeus, that's pretty hard to swallow. Your son is out there struggling to survive, and you can't even keep your wife from making his life a living hell. And yet, despite all the obstacles, Heracles went on to become a hero of legendary proportions, proving that, even if you're the child of a god who's not always around, you can still carve your own path. But here's the thing that makes this whole situation even more intriguing. Zeus didn't exactly step in to fix things for Heracles. Sure, he tried to help him out from time to time, but for the most part, Zeus allowed his son to fight his own battles. It's almost like Zeus thought that his kids had to earn their place in the world through their own struggles, maybe because that's what Zeus himself had to do to stay on top. So, while some gods like Apollo or Athena were born into relative stability, Heracles' path was marked by constant trials, tribulations, and yes, even the occasional brush with death. That brings us to another question. If Zeus's way of parenting was so hands-off at times, did he truly care about his children? Or was he more interested in their power, their utility, their usefulness to his reign? Some might say that Zeus's relationships with his children were based less on affection and more on how they could help him maintain control over the gods and mortals alike. It wasn't just about having a family for Zeus, it was about creating a family that could sustain his power for eternity. But before you start thinking that Zeus was just some cold, calculating god who used his children as pawns, remember this. There were moments where Zeus did act out of love, maybe not in the way you'd expect, but he did. Take, for example, his son Ares. Ares was the god of war, and, let's face it, he was a bit of a troublemaker. But despite his chaotic nature, Zeus still had a soft spot for him. Perhaps it was because Ares embodied a certain kind of passion that Zeus could appreciate. And maybe, just maybe, in some strange way, Zeus was proud of the way Ares fought to maintain his own position in the world. Zeus's parenting might not have followed any conventional script, but in his own unpredictable way, he helped shape some of the most iconic figures in Greek mythology. His legacy wasn't just about his divine thunderbolt or his role as king of the gods. It was also about how his children flawed, heroic, and troubled as they were carved their own destinies in the face of their father's complicated legacy. All right, we've talked about Zeus's often chaotic family life, his power struggles, and his complex relationships with his children, but let's take a moment to step back and explore the broader consequences of his reign as king of the gods. After all, when you've got so many gods, goddesses, and demigods under your rule, things are bound to get a little intense. And let me tell you, Zeus had some serious moments of divine mismanagement that could have ended a lot worse than they did. For one, let's talk about how Zeus managed disputes. Being the head of the Olympian gods meant that he was the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner. His decisions were final, and no one really had a choice but to obey. Sounds like a cushy job, right? Well, not when your job involves settling arguments between gods who are just as powerful as you are, if not more. It's like being in charge of a family where everyone thinks they're the boss, but you're the one stuck doing all the work. Take the case of Athena and Poseidon. These two gods had a massive argument over who would get to claim the city of Athens. They both wanted to be the patron deity of this mighty city, so they decided to offer the city something valuable to win the hearts of the Athenians. Poseidon, in his usual dramatic fashion, struck the ground with his trident, creating a saltwater spring. Sounds impressive, right? But Athena, being the goddess of wisdom, thought she'd offer something a little more practical, the olive tree. Not only was the tree useful for food, oil, and wood, but it symbolized peace and prosperity, exactly what Athens would need to thrive. In the end, the Athenians chose Athena's gift, and she became their patron goddess. Now, you'd think Zeus would just calmly announce the winner and move on, but nope. The situation turned into a full-blown mess. Poseidon didn't take his loss well surprise, and, while he grudgingly accepted Athena's victory, it created a deep-seated tension between the gods. It was this kind of divine drama that Zeus had to manage constantly, and it wasn't always easy. Even though he was the king of gods, Zeus didn't have all the answers. And in some cases, His solutions only made things worse. Let's talk about another case of divine drama that Zeus had to handle. One of the most notorious incidents involved the Titan Prometheus. You might know Prometheus for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to humans. While that might sound like a noble act of kindness, it was also a massive slap in the face to Zeus, who wasn't exactly in the mood to share his divine power with mortals. But Prometheus wasn't just giving out fire, he was also teaching humans how to survive, how to build civilizations, and even how to fight wars. To Zeus, this was an absolute affront. Not only had Prometheus stolen from him, but he had also given humans the knowledge they needed to potentially overthrow the gods. So, how did Zeus deal with this? Not with a simple reprimand. Oh no. Instead, Zeus had Prometheus bound to a rock, where an eagle would eat his liver every day, only for it to regenerate overnight. Talk about an overreaction, right? Prometheus was stuck in eternal suffering, but Zeus didn't care. In fact, Zeus was so set on punishing Prometheus for the crime of being kind to humanity that he made sure the punishment would last for an eternity. It was a move of pure spite, one that completely backfired in some ways, because it only made Prometheus a martyr for humankind. And by the way, Prometheus didn't regret what he did. The act of defiance had cemented his status as a champion of humanity, and people would remember his suffering for ages. But despite his wrath, Zeus didn't always have the final say in everything. In fact, sometimes he found himself at the mercy of other gods. For instance, take the story of Titanomachy, epic battle between the Olympians, led by Zeus, and the Titans, led by Kronos, Zeus's own father. The gods fought long and hard to overthrow the Titans and free themselves from Kronos' oppressive rule. Now, you'd think that Zeus, as the king of gods, would be the hero of this story, right? But the truth is, it was a team effort. Sure, Zeus led the charge, but he couldn't have done it without the help of his siblings, including Hestia, Demeter, and Poseidon. He had the power, yes, but it was his allies who ensured victory. And when it was over, Zeus took on the role of king, but the scars of war remained. Even in victory, the gods couldn't erase the trauma of the battles they had fought. In fact, the battle left an indelible mark on the gods' relationships with one another. Some gods became bitter rivals, while others grew closer in the aftermath. Zeus's reign, rather than bringing a peaceful order to the cosmos, was marked by constant power struggles and divine feuds. At the end of the day, Zeus may have been the king, but he wasn't the all-powerful, all-knowing ruler you might imagine. His reign, like his family life, was filled with cracks and imperfections. He didn't always know the best way to settle disputes. He didn't always have control over his children, or even his fellow gods. And most importantly, he didn't always make the best choices, but he was always trying to maintain that ultimate balance of power, and his reign would go on to influence the entire world of Greek mythology. Zeus didn't just rule through sheer force, he ruled through manipulation, charm, and sheer luck. Some gods loved him, others hated him, but no one could deny that he was the most important figure in Greek mythology, and no matter how chaotic things got, he kept on fighting for his position at the top. But of course, there were always gods and mortals who would challenge him. After all, when you're the king of everything, everyone else is always trying to take your throne. By now, you're probably getting a pretty clear picture of Zeus. The guy is powerful, persuasive, and let's face it, kind of a mess when it comes to family life. But the most interesting thing about Zeus is that his reign as the king of gods was never as secure as you might think. Sure, he had lightning bolts, immense power, and an army of gods at his disposal, but that didn't stop him from being a bit paranoid about losing his throne. The gods, after all, were far from the loyal, obedient beings you might imagine. In fact, Zeus was constantly facing challenges not just from mortals, but from his fellow gods as well. One of the biggest threats to Zeus's authority was, ironically, his own children. Now, you might think, how could your own kids be a threat to you when you're the almighty ruler of the gods? Well, Zeus had more than a few children who had the potential to overthrow him or at least challenge his authority, and the worst part, he was fully aware of this. Take Athena, for example. Athena was born from Zeus's head, fully grown and armed with wisdom, strategy, and divine knowledge. She was the goddess of wisdom and war, And while she certainly wasn't in line to overthrow Zeus, she was an incredibly powerful figure in her own right. And let's not forget her role in helping other gods and mortals to challenge Zeus's authority, whether directly or indirectly. So while Zeus might have loved his daughter, Athena was a constant reminder of the potential for godly rebellion, especially if she ever decided to turn her wisdom against him. And then there's Apollo, Zeus's son, who was a god of the sun, music, and prophecy. Apollo was another one of Zeus's children who possessed an immense amount of power. As the god of prophecy, Apollo could foresee future events, including the potential demise of his father. And this is where things get tricky. You see, Apollo had his own ambitions and desires, especially when it came to his role among the gods. Apollo wasn't content with simply being the god of the sun, he wanted more. And his father, Zeus, knew this. Apollo's ever-growing influence in the divine realm was something Zeus had to keep in check, because Apollo's power wasn't to be underestimated. But it wasn't just the children who posed a threat to Zeus's reign. His siblings were just as eager for power as he was. Take Poseidon, for example. Poseidon, the god of the sea, was Zeus's brother, and in many ways, Poseidon was just as powerful as Zeus. Sure, Zeus might have had the sky and the thunder, but Poseidon ruled the oceans. Now, you might think that brothers, especially two as powerful as these, would get along after all. They had just overthrown their father together. But nope. Poseidon wasn't satisfied being second in command, even if that meant bowing to Zeus as the king of gods. And there were times, especially in the myths, when Poseidon made it clear that he wasn't going to just play along with Zeus's plans. He had his own agenda, and that meant keeping Zeus on his toes. But the real kicker, the ultimate threat to Zeus, came from the prophecy. As it turns out, the gods were cursed with prophecies, many of which predicted their fall from grace. And one such prophecy, one that Zeus took very seriously, stated that one of his children would eventually overthrow him. Now, imagine that for a second. You're Zeus. You've spent eons building your empire, overthrowing your father, and becoming the supreme god of Mount Olympus. And then this prophecy comes along, whispering that your own blood might be the one to end your reign. I mean, that's some seriously stressful stuff. And, in true Zeus fashion, he did what anyone in his position would do, tried to stop it. Now, you might remember that Zeus had this habit of swallowing his wives. In fact, he swallowed Metis, the mother of Athena, because he feared that the child she carried would be the one to defeat him. Athena was destined to be born from him, but as we've seen, that didn't exactly go as planned. But in Zeus's mind, doing whatever it took to control his destiny was the only option. He didn't want to end up like his father, Kronos, who had been overthrown by his own children. To prevent the same fate, Zeus did everything in his power to ensure that no one would challenge his throne, whether it was through manipulation, subterfuge, or outright punishment. But here's where things take a wild turn. Zeus's constant fear of being overthrown actually ended up causing him more problems than it solved. The more he tried to control his children and their fates, the more he created resentment among the gods. They weren't happy being pawns in Zeus's divine game. As a result, they started looking for ways to defy him, to challenge him, and in some cases, to outright rebel. For example, take the story of Titanomachy again. Zeus led the Olympians in battle against the Titans, but when the dust settled, the Olympians didn't just accept Zeus as the undisputed ruler of the universe. There were still factions, lingering resentments, and gods who thought they deserved more. And Zeus, in his infinite wisdom, knew that he had to keep these gods busy. You know what they say about idle hands being the devil's workshop. Zeus did his best to keep the gods engaged, either by sending them on missions or encouraging them to feud amongst themselves. In fact, you could argue that Zeus's greatest strength, his ability to control the gods, was also his greatest weakness. He was constantly working, not to make things better, but simply to keep everything from falling apart. He had to keep the gods occupied, his children in check, and himself on top. But eventually, you can only hold things together for so long. Zeus, despite all his power, was still terrified of losing it, and that fear drove his every decision, every relationship, and every plot. He knew that as long as there were gods as powerful as he was, the throne of Olympus was never truly his to keep. And maybe, deep down, that fear of his own downfall only brought on by his own children, no less was the very thing that kept Zeus on edge for the rest of his reign. And yet, in some strange way, this constant fear, this need for control, is what made Zeus such an enduring figure in Greek mythology. His ability to outwit, overpower, and manipulate his way through challenges is what made him the ultimate god. But, of course, it also meant that Zeus could never truly rest easy. His reign was defined not by the peace he created, but by the constant struggle to maintain it. Now, let's zoom out a little bit and look at the big picture. Zeus was not just a god who ruled over his family and the god, she was also a significant figure in the mortal world. His decisions impacted everyone, from the gods of Mount Olympus to the lowliest mortal. But how did Zeus interact with the human realm? Was he a benevolent deity who guided mortals toward prosperity? Or was he more of a meddling force, leaving destruction and chaos in his wake? The truth is, Zeus's relationship with mortals was incredibly complicated. On one hand, he was often portrayed as a protector of justice, order, and hospitality. The ancient Greeks looked to him as the god who maintained the laws of the universe. In fact, the very idea of hospitality, or xenia, was something that Zeus took very seriously. According to myth, Zeus would disguise himself as a mortal and wander the earth, testing the kindness and hospitality of human beings. If they welcomed him, they were rewarded, but if they were rude or dismissive, they would face the wrath of Zeus himself. This is where we get some of the most famous stories of Zeus's interactions with human stories that were, in many ways, moral lessons for the people of ancient Greece. One of the most famous stories is that of Baucis and Philemon, an elderly couple who, when Zeus, disguised as a poor traveller, came to their door, offered him shelter and hospitality without hesitation. In return for their kindness, Zeus and Hermes, his trusty companion, transformed the couple into two intertwined trees, ensuring that they would live forever together in peace. But the flip side to these stories is that Zeus wasn't above punishing mortals for their mistakes, sometimes severely. Take the story of Lycaon, for example. Lycaon was a king who wanted to test whether Zeus was truly a god. So, he served Zeus a meal made from the flesh of his own son. Zeus was so enraged that he turned Lycaon into a wolf, and thus we have the mythological origins of werewolves. While Lycaon's punishment might seem extreme, it fits within Zeus's larger pattern. When mortals crossed the line, they paid a heavy price. But when mortals honored the gods, they were often rewarded. However, Zeus wasn't just about judgment and punishment. He also got involved in the lives of mortals in more personal ways, especially when it came to romance. If you've been paying attention to how Zeus treated his wives and mistresses, you can probably guess that his affairs with mortals weren't exactly modest. Zeus wasn't shy about seducing mortal women, and often his escapades resulted in the birth of demigods' children who were half god, half human. Some of these children, like Heracles, became legendary heroes, while others were just footnotes in the greater narrative of Zeus's many affairs. One of the most famous stories of Zeus's romantic escapades with mortals is the tale of Alcmene, a mortal woman who was seduced by Zeus in the guise of her husband, Amphitryon. Alcmene thought she was being faithful to her husband, but in reality, she was unknowingly carrying Zeus's child, Heracles. This isn't exactly a story about true love, is it? Yet, in typical Zeus fashion, he continued to meddle in the mortal realm, leaving behind a trail of half-god children who would go on to have legendary adventures. For mortals like Alcmene, the lines between the divine and the mortal world were blurred, and Zeus was a central figure in making that happen. But here's where things get more complex. Zeus's involvement with mortals wasn't always as charming as his romantic liaisons. Take, for instance, the story of Io, the beautiful priestess whom Zeus fell in love with. When Hera found out, she was furious and turned Io into a cow to keep her away from Zeus. Now, rather than stepping in and fixing things, Zeus, ever the opportunist, continued his pursuit of Io. Eventually, Io was released from her transformation, but only after enduring a series of tragic events. This is the real tension in Zeus's dealings with mortals. She had a tendency to treat them as pawns in his own divine game. He didn't always act with the kind of grace you might expect from the king of the gods. One of Zeus's more interesting traits was his contradictions. He could be the loving father, the god of justice, and the protector of the weak, but he could also be the god of chaos, power struggles, and violence. As much as he cared for his own children, his relationships with mortals often seemed more selfish or self-serving. At times, Zeus appeared to act as though he was the one who needed saving, that the world needed to revolve around him. This is why Zeus's reign was never truly stable. His character, his actions, and his desires constantly shifted between light and dark. It was this duality that made him a compelling, but flawed, figure in Greek mythology. Yet despite all the contradictions, Zeus remained the ultimate authority. Mortals still looked to him as the protector of justice, the one who would keep the world in balance. And even as Zeus got more and more entangled in the lives of mortals, there was a sense that he was both above them and deeply connected to them. The gods might have lived on Mount Olympus, but they were still involved in the world of humans, whether through love, wrath, or punishment. The question, of course, is, was Zeus truly just? Did he truly rule with wisdom, or was he simply acting out of his own self-interest? Some might argue that his reign was a mix of both, sometimes wise, sometimes reckless. But in the end, Zeus was always the one at the center of the mythological universe, and his decisions, whether for good or ill, shaped the world around him for generations. And so, the legend of Zeus lives on. His power, his struggles, his romances, and his flaws continue to captivate us to this day. Because despite all the chaos, Zeus, the mighty king of the gods, remains a figure who is simultaneously all-powerful and completely, painfully human. So, by now, we've seen that Zeus wasn't just the king of the gods, but also a god who was constantly dealing with the fallout of his own actions, both divine and mortal. But if there's one thing that Zeus is famous for, it's his ability to bend the rules, to charm, to manipulate, or to act impulsively when the situation demands it. But what happens when the almighty Zeus controls the skies, the thunder, and even the fates of gods and mortals alike, finds himself facing an issue that's beyond his control? What happens when Zeus, the master of manipulation, comes face to face with his own limitations? We know that Zeus, throughout his reign, faced countless challenges, but these challenges weren't always external. Sometimes, the real battle was with himself. Imagine being Zeus. You've ruled for eons, you've kept the universe in balance, you've overcome your own father, and your own family members are constantly vying for power. You're used to getting your way, to commanding respect, to controlling every situation with your divine might. You're the guy who's supposed to be untouchable. And yet, there are still forces at play that Zeus can't control, things that threaten to undo everything he's built. One such issue was his own mortality. Yes, I'm serious. Despite being the king of gods, Zeus knew that he wasn't immune to the same fate that befell every living being: death. We've seen that Zeus could manipulate destiny, intervene in mortal affairs, and change the course of events, but there was still one thing he couldn't escape: time. The gods might live for an eternity, but even immortals are bound by fate in some sense. And with every child Zeus fathered, every kingdom he ruled, every decision he made, he knew he was pushing himself closer to the inevitable. Take, for example, his struggles with his own legacy. As we mentioned before, Zeus feared that one of his children would eventually overthrow him. He might have avoided the prophecy of being overthrown by a zombie swallowing Metis whole, for instance, but the fear never truly left him. With every new birth, with every new child, Zeus was reminded of his own vulnerability. Each god, goddess, and demigod born of Zeus carried with it a reminder that Zeus himself wasn't the ultimate force in the universe. He couldn't control every outcome, and he couldn't prevent his own legacy from eventually fading into the future. But here's the thing: Zeus wasn't the type to sit around and wait for that inevitable downfall. He fought tooth and nail to maintain his reign, even if it meant creating chaos along the way. And yet, his obsession with maintaining control often resulted in situations that he couldn't handle or, worse yet, didn't know how to fix. Take the case of Prometheus once again. The Titan had defied Zeus and given fire to humanity, a direct challenge to Zeus's rule. Now, we all know how that story ended. Prometheus was bound to a rock, tortured by an eagle, his liver eternally regenerated. But here's the catch: Prometheus was never the true problem. The real problem was Zeus's fear of losing control. Zeus's need to maintain his power through punishment and fear ultimately made him blind to the possibility that Prometheus's actions were actually beneficial to humanity. And in some way, this speaks to Zeus's greatest flaw, his insecurity. Despite all his power, Zeus was often ruled by a fear of losing control, of losing his authority, because he understood, deep down, that it could all unravel at any moment. As much as Zeus was the ultimate power on Mount Olympus, he was also vulnerable. His relationships with his fellow gods and his children were a constant balancing act. He had to keep the gods at bay, while managing the emotional and often political struggles of his offspring. The moment he let his guard down, when he took a break from the throne, when he showed any weakness, the entire structure of Olympus could have collapsed. He was a king, yes, but a king constantly on edge, never fully trusting that the empire he'd built could last. And that's where the intervention of the gods becomes so significant. Unlike the other gods, who were often willing to fight for power or betray their family members for gain, Zeus had to be strategic in his relationships. If one of his children grew too powerful, he had to either suppress them or manipulate their destinies. He couldn't afford to let anyone challenge him, not even his own offspring. If they began to rise too high, Zeus would either put them in their place or force them into situations where they would fail. A perfect example of this is the way Zeus dealt with Heracles. Even though Heracles was the son of Zeus, born out of an affair with Alcmene, the demigod Hero's rise to fame and power was a direct challenge to Zeus. Heracles wasn't just a mighty hero, was beloved by mortals and gods alike. He completed the 12 labors, overcame impossible odds, and ultimately became the stuff of legend. Yet, despite this incredible strength and influence, Zeus had to keep him in check. He did so by sending Heracles on impossible tasks, missions that would test the very limits of his powers. But instead of feeling pride for his son's achievements, Zeus used them as opportunities to assert his control over Heracles. In many ways, Heracles was a reminder of Zeus's own vulnerability, of the possibility that one day his power might be overshadowed by the very people he created. But there was another side to this story, the side where Zeus wasn't just an insecure ruler, but also a father who deeply cared about his children. As much as he wanted to maintain control, Zeus still had moments of tenderness and affection, even if those moments were few and far between. And though his methods were often harsh and impulsive, they came from a place of protectiveness. He saw the potential for greatness in his children, even if that greatness sometimes posed a threat to his own reign. It's this complex relationship between power, fear, love, and insecurity that makes Zeus such a fascinating figure. He wasn't just a god who ruled with an iron fist, was a ruler constantly fighting against his own vulnerabilities. And in the end, it wasn't just his enemies who threatened his reign, it was the constant fear that his own power would fade, that one of his children might one day be more powerful than him, and that the empire of the gods would crumble. But this is also the reason Zeus remains such a lasting and dynamic figure in mythology. He didn't just sit back and let events unfold, he fought for control, fought for his legacy, and fought for his place as the ruler of the gods. And while his methods were flawed, while his reign was filled with contradictions, Zeus remained the god who embodied both ultimate power and ultimate vulnerability. All right, let's take a moment to slow things down and reflect on a more philosophical aspect of Zeus's reign. Now, we've seen his many flaws, his chaotic relationships, his manipulative tactics, his obsession with control, and yet, despite all of this, Zeus is still the figure who holds the universe together in Greek mythology. What makes him a god who is so deeply revered and also so utterly misunderstood at times is his paradoxical nature. You could call Zeus the perfect embodiment of both strength and weakness, of the protector and the destroyer. His rule was never just about power, it was about balance, even if that balance was often precarious. This balance, however, is something that Zeus maintained not just for himself, but for all of existence. You see, Greek mythology isn't simply about gods wreaking havoc on the world, it's about the cosmic order. It's about how the universe is held together by a delicate balance, and how gods like Zeus are responsible for keeping that balance in check. Think about it, without Zeus, the gods of Olympus would have been in constant turmoil. Without him, there would have been no laws to govern the divine realm. no hierarchy to follow, no true authority to ensure justice was done. In that sense, Zeus was the ultimate enforcer of cosmic law. It wasn't just his job to rule over his children or smite his enemies, it was his responsibility to make sure the universe worked. But unlike other gods who may have acted purely out of their own desires or whims, Zeus was the one who kept everything aligned. If there was chaos in the mortal world, or even in the world of the gods, Zeus was the one who had to restore order, even if it meant making difficult decisions. And let's face it, some of those decisions were more than a little morally ambiguous. Take the case of the Titans, for example. Zeus led the charge in the battle against his own father, Kronos, and the Titans who had once ruled the universe. He cast the Titans down, imprisoned them in Tartarus, and established his own rule over Mount Olympus. But here's the thing, Kronos, despite being a ruthless ruler, wasn't entirely evil. He was a tyrant, yes, but in his own way. He represented a kind of orderal, be it an oppressive one. Zeus, by overthrowing him, had to establish a new orderone that was his own, one that could work under his reign. But the moral question is this: was Zeus's reign truly the best for the cosmos? Or was it just a shift in power, a change from one ruler to another? Did the world truly get better under Zeus? Or did it simply become a more chaotic version of its former self? After all, even with Zeus in charge, the gods and mortals alike still faced turmoil, wars, and constant power struggles. As the king of the gods, Zeus wasn't able to eliminate conflict. In fact, his reign seemed to create even more of it. So what does that tell us about the nature of his rule? One of the key moments in understanding Zeus's complex rule comes from his relationship with fate. You see, no matter how much Zeus might want to control the universe or manipulate the outcome of events, fate was something that even he couldn't escape. It's like trying to play a game when the rules are already set in stone. And the funny thing is, even though Zeus was the most powerful being in the universe, he couldn't break those rules. There were limits to his power. In fact, Zeus's biggest weakness was his inability to escape fate, a force that was as uncontrollable and inevitable as time itself. It's often said that Zeus feared the prophecies of his children overthrowing him. He feared that one day his reign would come to an end. And while he tried to circumvent these prophecies through swallowing Metis, through tricking or manipulating his children, the fact remained that fate was an unavoidable force. No matter how many times Zeus manipulated the course of events, it would only delay the inevitable. This struggle with fate trying to control what he couldn't was perhaps one of Zeus's most human qualities. But let's take a step back. Despite all of these complications, Zeus's role as the enforcer of justice was paramount. In a world where chaos and disorder could easily reign, Zeus stood as the stabilizing force. And perhaps that's why, despite all the messy family drama and questionable decisions, Zeus is still regarded as the ultimate god. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't always fair, but he was the one who kept the balance. And without him, who knows where the universe would have ended up? In fact, Zeus was the glue that held not just the gods, but the very fabric of the world together. He ensured that the laws of nature were obeyed, that the seasons came and went as they should, that the world's natural order was maintained. When we think of Greek mythology, we often think of grand battles and heroic deeds. But at the core of it all was Zeus, the god who ruled, not with an iron fist, but with the responsibility of keeping the cosmos in harmony. And, as we mentioned earlier, it wasn't just his strength that made Zeus such a powerful figure, it was his responsibility. The weight of the universe was on his shoulders, and even though he may have been flawed, even though he may have acted out of fear, jealousy, or ambition, Zeus was ultimately the god who had the final say in everything. In a sense, he represented the struggle of all rulers, balancing the demands of power with the ever-present fear of losing it. What's fascinating about Zeus is that, in his flaws, he mirrored humanity. He had moments of greatness and weakness, courage and fear. And in a way, that's what made him such a compelling figure, not just in the realm of the gods, but in the stories told by mortals. Zeus's character wasn't a simple archetype of the all-powerful god. He was a humanized deity, one who struggled with power, identity, and legacy just like anyone who holds ultimate responsibility. As much as Zeus feared his downfall, as much as he struggled to maintain control, he did so because he understood the true cost of losing it all. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic thing about him. His fear of losing control ultimately prevented him from ever truly embracing the freedom that comes with being a ruler. Now that we've delved into the complexities of Zeus's reign and his struggles with power, it's important to take a moment and look at the legacy he left behind. After all, Zeus wasn't just a king of the gods. He was a pivotal figure who shaped not only the divine world but also the mortal one. His influence was far-reaching, impacting the course of human history in ways both profound and subtle. Zeus's legacy is a mixed bag. On one hand, he was the god who protected justice, a god who wielded his power in order to maintain order and balance. But on the other hand, his complicated relationships, his manipulations, and his unchecked power also left a trail of pain and betrayal. The consequences of his decisions echoed through generations of gods, demigods, and mortals, shaping not just the course of Greek mythology, but the very foundation of ancient Greek values and beliefs. In many ways, Zeus's legacy was shaped by his family, his children in particular. As the god of the sky and ruler of the gods, he fathered a number of legendary heroes and heroines whose fates were intertwined with his own in ways that were often messy, tragic, and unexpected. One of the most interesting things about Zeus's children is how they acted as both extensions of his power and symbols of the things he couldn't control, things like fate, destiny, and the complexities of human nature. Let's start with Heracles. Heracles, the son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, became the quintessential hero of Greek mythology. His 12 labors are among the most famous stories in all of mythology, and his strength, bravery, and endurance made him a beloved figure both among the gods and mortals. But while Heracles was certainly one of Zeus's most successful children, his life was anything but easy. Despite being the son of a god, Heracles had to struggle with constant challenges, many of which were orchestrated by Zeus's wife, Hera. Even though Zeus tried to protect his son, he couldn't shield him from Hera's wrath, and in many ways, Heracles' life became a series of tests to prove his worth not just as the son of Zeus, but as a hero in his own right. Heracles' legacy, much like Zeus's, was marked by a tension between greatness and suffering. It's the story of a hero who could accomplish anything but who was also bound by the very fate that Zeus could never escape. No matter how powerful you are, you can never fully control your destiny. In many ways, Heracles' trials became a metaphor for the struggle Zeus himself faced throughout his reign, having all the power in the world, yet being powerless against the forces of fate. Then there's Athena, another child of Zeus, who became the goddess of wisdom and war. Athena's relationship with Zeus was, in many ways, one of mutual respect. She emerged from his head in a spectacularly strange birth, but despite the oddity of her origins, Athena became one of the most respected figures in the pantheon. Unlike many of Zeus's other children, Athena was not just a reflection of his power, but also an extension of his wisdom. Athena's intellectual prowess and strategic mind made her a figure who embodied the qualities that Zeus might have lacked: the ability to think before acting, to strategize, and to rule with wisdom rather than sheer force. Athena's legacy was shaped by the way she not only aligned herself with Zeus's power, but also with the ideal of divine justice. In fact, Athena was often the one who intervened when Zeus's decisions seemed too impulsive or short-sighted. Athena was the voice of reason when Zeus acted on impulse, and as such, she represented the balance that was often missing in his rule. But her relationship with Zeus also shows us another side of the god. While he was often mired in conflict, Athena represented his aspiration for a world built on wisdom, strategy, and fairness. Her legacy was tied to her ability to rise above the chaos that Zeus sometimes perpetuated, becoming a goddess who embodied the qualities Zeus could never fully grasp. On the other hand, you have Apollo, one of Zeus's more famous and influential children. As the god of the sun, music, and prophecy, Apollo was deeply intertwined with the fabric of Greek life. His role as a prophet made him a significant figure, as he was seen as the one who could reveal the future to both gods and mortals. Apollo's talents were unparalleled, and his ability to influence the world through prophecy and his association with the arts made him a symbol of divine perfection. However, Apollo's legacy, much like Zeus's, was complicated. While he achieved greatness, He was also involved in numerous conflicts and tragedies, including his feud with Hermes over the lyre and his ill-fated interactions with mortal lovers. Apollo's story highlights the tension between perfection and imperfection, and his flaws and conflicts mirrored the very things that Zeus struggled with throughout his reign. Zeus's influence wasn't confined to his children alone. His impact reached far beyond the divine. His actions, both good and bad, rippled through the mortal realm. The ancient Greeks looked to Zeus for guidance on how to live a life that was aligned with justice, law, and order, but they also understood the dangers of unchecked power. Zeus's relationship with mortals was a complex one, filled with both blessings and curses. He could bring prosperity to those who honored him, but he could also unleash terrible wrath on those who angered him. His legacy is also evident in the way that the Greeks viewed the natural world. As the god of the sky, Zeus was responsible for the weather, the seasons, and the cycles of nature. He was the embodiment of order in a world that was otherwise full of chaos. In this way, Zeus's legacy became a symbol of the balance between nature's forces. His power was seen not just as destructive, but as necessary for maintaining the harmony of the world. But perhaps the most significant part of Zeus's legacy lies in his flaws. We tend to idolize gods in mythology, but Zeus was always portrayed as deeply human. His relationships were messy, his decisions often rash, and his fears real. Zeus's story is the story of someone who had everything but still struggled to maintain control. It's a story of a ruler whose greatest challenge wasn't fighting his enemies or conquering new lands, it was learning how to keep the balance, to rule with wisdom, and to understand the nature of his own power. In the end, Zeus's legacy was one of complexity. He was the king of gods, a figure who held the universe together with his rule, yet he was also a man of great contradictions, his reign marked by both glory and failure. His children, his actions, and his relationships with mortals were all part of the grand tapestry that made up his legacy. And though Zeus may have feared the end of his reign, his story lives on, not just in the myths and legends of ancient Greece, but in the lessons we still draw from his life. Let's take a moment to think about the bigger picture. Zeus, despite being the king of all gods, was not merely a figure of power or dominance. No, Zeus was a symbol of both divine strength and divine imperfection. And that's what makes him so compelling in Greek mythology. He wasn't just a flawless ruler, reigning over his realm without consequences. Instead, Zeus's reign was marked by a continuous constant tug-of-war between the immense responsibilities of power and the limitations that even a god like him could never escape. Zeus's most enduring legacy isn't just the wealth of divine knowledge or power he wielded, it's the moral complexity he represents. He didn't live a life of pristine virtue, nor was he a perfect deity. He didn't rule with a gentle hand, nor did he act with unshakable justice. In fact, his rule was riddled with contradiction. She was a protector, yes, but also a destroyer, a god who cherished justice, but whose actions sometimes betrayed it. One of the most telling aspects of Zeus's character is his unpredictability. You could never really tell what he was going to do next. Would he punish mortals or reward them for their kindness? Would he avenge his children, or would he make their lives more difficult for reasons only he understood? Zeus was often a god of impulse. He'd make decisions that seemed wise one moment and foolish the next. His relationships with the other gods and with mortals were never consistent. Sometimes he was a loving father, sometimes a vengeful king, and sometimes a deceiver. Take the tale of Zeus and Prometheus, for instance. Zeus punished Prometheus for giving fire to humanity, but at the same time, Zeus needed humanity to survive. After all, his very reign depended on the order he created, which was inextricably linked to the actions of humans. Prometheus's gift of fire allowed humans to advance, to build civilizations, and to eventually challenge the gods in their own way. Zeus, who thought he was stopping the spread of knowledge, was actually setting the stage for a new kind of power to emerge that didn't rest solely in the hands of the gods. This is one of the most profound lessons in Greek mythology. Even gods like Zeus couldn't stop the natural progression of the world, no matter how hard they tried. Zeus's reign also demonstrates the idea that even the most powerful entities can fall prey to their own internal contradictions. His continuous fear of being overthrown, his manipulations of his children, and his inability to control fate or time it all points to the notion that power is fleeting and no one is immune from the consequences of their actions. In this way, Zeus's reign was less about his eternal supremacy and more about the balance he tried and ultimately failed to maintain. While he maintained power, he could never truly control it. But let's look beyond his flaws. Zeus's mythology is also full of moments where he displayed moments of genuine wisdom. His decisions weren't always rash. Sometimes, he did the right thing, especially when it came to protecting the cosmic order. It wasn't always the most obvious or compassionate choice, but it was often the necessary one. Take, for instance, his involvement in the Titanomachy, the war between the Titans and the Olympians. This was a battle for supremacy, but it wasn't just about power. It was about the future of the universe itself. In overthrowing Kronos, Zeus and his siblings ensured that the world would continue under a new ordera, more dynamic one, filled with change, growth, and the complexities of the human world. Without Zeus, the universe would have remained stagnant, bound by the old rules, controlled by Kronos' oppressive reign. So, while Zeus was sometimes impulsive, his actions also created the framework for the universe to grow and evolve. What's fascinating is that Zeus wasn't alone in creating the world's rules. He often relied on his siblings and even his children to help maintain that cosmic order. Just as he worked with Poseidon and Hades to divide the realms, Zeus also worked with Athena, Apollo, and even mortals to ensure that balance was maintained. It's a testament to his intelligence that he understood the need for collaboration, that even as the supreme god, he couldn't control everything. And in some strange way, this need for cooperation shows another side of his character. Despite his overwhelming power, Zeus understood that the strength of his reign was built upon unity, not just domination. But in the end, Zeus's story is a tragic one, if only in the sense that he could never escape the burden of his power. Despite all his attempts to manipulate, control, and protect the balance of the world, Zeus remained, at his core, a figure who was constantly at war with himself. He feared losing his power, yet he knew he couldn't hold on to it forever. He tried to secure his legacy through manipulation and control, but at the same time, he gave birth to children who, in many ways, represented the future figures that were destined to inherit the world he'd helped shape. When you look at Zeus from this perspective, you begin to see a figure who is as much a symbol of inevitable change as he is of immovable power. His story isn't just about a god who ruled with thunder and lightning, it's about a figure who was constantly trying to manage a chaotic universe. In this way, Zeus was a fascinating paradox. He was both the embodiment of order and the cause of disorder. His flaws didn't diminish his greatness, and his greatness didn't absolve his flaws. Rather, it was this balance of traits that made him such a compelling figure in myth. Zeus's struggles, whether in his relationships with his children, his interactions with other gods, or his attempts to outsmart Hera, a reminder that no matter how great or powerful one becomes, there are always limits. Zeus, as powerful as he was, couldn't escape these limits, and that, in many ways, makes him relatable. At the end of the day, Zeus wasn't just a god who wielded lightning, he was a ruler who lived in constant tension with his own humanity. And so, the myth of Zeus lives on not because he was invincible, but because he was a god who struggled with the same fears and flaws that we all experience. His story serves as both a lesson and a warning, that even the greatest of rulers, no matter how mighty they may seem, are still vulnerable to the forces of fate, the tides of change, and the complexities of the human heart. As we reach the final chapters of Zeus's tumultuous tale, it's important to reflect on just how much of his life revolved around one of the most fundamental human experiences, fear of the unknown. Despite being the mightiest of all gods, Zeus was constantly confronting the uncertainties of fate, the consequences of his actions, and the perpetual threat of losing his power. And in that, he shares a very human quality with all of us. No matter how much control we think we have, there's always something lurking beyond our reach. Zeus's fear of being overthrown wasn't just about his power being stripped away, it was about the unpredictability of his world. His life was not the neat, orderly existence one might expect from a god who sat at the top of the cosmic hierarchy. No, Zeus's life was filled with uncertainties: his family, his relationships, and his very own mortality. At times, Zeus felt like he was fighting to maintain control over a universe that was, at its core, chaotic, and this is the paradox. For all his power, Zeus was trapped in a constant cycle of anxiety. The very thing that made him powerful, the ability to manipulate and control, was the very thing that kept him on edge. Every victory he achieved came with the looming knowledge that the balance could tip at any moment. Let's revisit some of the key moments where Zeus's fear was most apparent. One of the most striking examples comes from the early days of his reign, shortly after he had overthrown his father, Kronos. You might think that this would have been a moment of celebration for Zeus, the moment when he finally took his place as the undisputed king of the gods. But no, Zeus's victory over Kronos didn't end with a sigh of relief. Instead, it was marked by a fear of betrayal. For centuries, Kronos had ruled the universe with an iron fist, devouring his own children out of fear that they would one day overthrow him. And now, Zeus, having defeated his father, became terrified of the same thing happening to him. To maintain his power, Zeus felt the need to dominate his family, his siblings, his children, and his rivals alike. He couldn't afford to show weakness. He couldn't let anyone see that he was vulnerable to the same fate his father had suffered. As a result, his relationships were always marked by tension, distrust, and the constant need to assert his authority. Every act of rebellion, every challenge to his rule, whether it came from the gods, his children, or mortals, was a reminder that Zeus's power was fragile. The world he ruled was, in essence, a house of cards, where one wrong move could bring everything crashing down. Zeus's relationship with his children is a perfect example of how this fear manifested. Take Athena, for example, his firstborn. When Athena emerged from his head fully grown, armed, and wise, she wasn't just a remarkable goddess. She was a reminder of the threat that children pose to a father's authority. Zeus knew that Athena was a force to be reckoned with, one who could potentially challenge him, just as he had challenged his own father. So, while he loved her, he was also constantly wary of her growing influence. His fear that one of his children would overtake him was an ever-present undercurrent in his interactions with them. But it wasn't just Athena. Zeus also had to deal with Heracles, the son of his affair with Alcmene. Despite being a mighty hero, Heracles posed a unique threat to Zeus's reign. Heracles was beloved by mortals and gods alike, and his feats of strength and bravery made him a figure who could easily overshadow Zeus in the eyes of those who worshipped the gods. Zeus, in his typical fashion, manipulated and controlled Heracles, sending him on the 12 labor tasks that were impossible even for a demigod. But here's the interesting part. Zeus didn't just want to stop Heracles from surpassing him. He wanted to test him. Zeus wanted to see if his son could rise above the trials he set before him. In a way, it was almost like Zeus was training Heracles to be more powerful than he already was, without fully understanding that the more he tested his son, the more he risked creating a hero capable of dethroning him. Then, there's Apollo, the god of prophecy, who possessed a knowledge of the future that Zeus couldn't control. Prophecy was something that both terrified and fascinated Zeus. He tried to control the prophecies as much as possible, but even he knew that some things were beyond his reach. Apollo's role as the god of prophecy was a constant reminder to Zeus that his fate was not in his hands. His own downfall, foretold in the many prophecies surrounding his children, was always looming. And no matter how much Zeus tried to manipulate his family or his own future, he couldn't avoid the reality that one day his reign would end. He didn't have the power to change the course of time. So, what do we make of all this? What does it mean that Zeus, the most powerful god in Greek mythology, was consumed by fear? The answer is both simple and profound. Even the greatest figures of power are still subject to the forces of destiny. Zeus might have been able to manipulate events, control the elements, and dominate the gods, but he could never control the outcome of his own life. He could never escape the fact that his legacy, like everyone's, would eventually come to an end. But in a way, that's what makes Zeus so relatable. He wasn't just a god, he was a symbol of the tension between human desire and fate. Despite his divine nature, Zeus's fears, struggles, and doubts are what make him so enduring. His legacy isn't just about the power he wielded, it's about the very human fears he faced. The fear of being overthrown, the fear of losing control, the fear of not being enough. And so, as we reflect on Zeus's legacy, we realize that power is not just about domination, it's about the ability to manage and cope with the things that lie beyond your control. Zeus ruled over the gods and mortals alike, but in his heart, he understood that nothing lasts forever. He was the king of gods, but he was also a god at war with his own destiny. As we continue our journey through the myth of Zeus, it's impossible to ignore one crucial aspect of his character, his immortality. While many might think that the eternal nature of the gods would free them from fear and doubt, Zeus's immortality actually heightened his internal struggles. You see, unlike mortals who experience life in distinct chapters, birth, growth, decay, and death, Zeus and the other gods were trapped in a cycle of eternal existence. For Zeus, immortality was both a gift and a curse. Immortality meant he could never truly rest. The universe didn't pause for Zeus. It constantly shifted, with mortals rising and falling, gods plotting and rebelling, and the natural world continuing its endless cycle of birth and death. In a way, Zeus's immortality forced him to be constantly vigilant. His reign, no matter how secure it appeared, was never truly safe. As the king of gods, his life was a constant balance of forces between his divine power and the forces of fate, between his family dynamics and his rule, between maintaining order and dealing with chaos. There was always something at stake. One could argue that Zeus's immortality was the very thing that made him feel isolated. While other gods might have their own domains, Poseidon had the seas, Hades the underworld, Zeus had to rule everything. And in ruling everything, he often found himself torn between the needs of the world and the demands of his personal life. His immortality meant that he would never truly escape from the responsibilities he carried as the head of the gods. There was no retirement for Zeus, no final act of peace where he could rest easy and hand over the reins. As long as the cosmos existed, so would he constantly forced to balance his duties, his desires, and his deep-seated fears. This immortality also meant that Zeus could never fully experience the joy of a beginning and an end. He couldn't enjoy the simplicity of mortal life, where the knowledge of inevitable endings gives meaning to beginnings. Zeus, as a god, had no true beginning or end. He was the eternal force that shaped the world, and so his sense of identity was constantly in flux. Who was he without his power? Who was he without his legacy? These questions, although never directly answered in the myths, were surely at the core of Zeus's mind, even if only on an unconscious level. But immortality didn't only create internal turmoil, it also created a distantness from mortals. The gods, living forever, were fundamentally different from those they ruled. The cycle of human life, birth, aging and death was something Zeus could never experience. He might have been able to manipulate time, control seasons, and even help humans rise from the ashes of war, but he couldn't participate in the most human of experiences, mortality. And in that absence, Zeus began to separate himself from humanity, becoming more of a distant observer than an active participant. His interactions with mortals, whether in love or wrath, became defined by distance. He was the ultimate ruler, but also the ultimate outsider, untouched by the struggles that made mortals feel alive. Perhaps this explains some of his tragic mistakes. The very fact that he couldn't die, that he was an eternal being, made his decisions feel both momentous and insignificant. Zeus had all the time in the world to make mistakes, to learn from them, but the nature of his immortality also made him stagnant. His regrets, his fear of change, and his obsessive need to control his destiny often led him to decisions that didn't just affect him, they affected generations of gods, mortals, and entire civilizations. Zeus had no final act of redemption or downfall. His immortality meant his story was never truly over, and maybe that's what made his legacy so haunting. What's most interesting about this aspect of immortality is how it relates to Zeus's eternal role as a father. We've already discussed how his relationships with his children were shaped by power, dynamics, and fear. But, more than that, they were shaped by Zeus's sense of endlessness. As a father who would live forever, how could he ever truly see the consequences of his actions? In the world of mortals, the impact of a parent's choices can be seen across a lifespan, and there's a certain finality in that. But for Zeus, his children, no matter what mistakes he made, would be alive forever too, in one way or another. Their actions would stretch into eternity, much like his own. Take Apollo again. Apollo's legacy's role as the god of prophecy, and the sun was not one bound by time. He was a god who existed not just as a son of Zeus, but as an eternal figure whose actions had eternal consequences. While Zeus watched his children grow, change, and impact the world in ways he might not always control, he was bound by his own constancy. This paradoxed the idea that Zeus, despite his omnipotence, had to watch everything unfold without being able to experience the changes that come with mortality shaped much of his character. He was perpetually caught in this cycle of eternity, unable to fully break free or evolve. So, what can we learn from this strange immortality that Zeus was cursed with? Perhaps it's this, that immortality is not the blessing it seems. Sure, it might seem appealing at first glance. Who wouldn't want to live forever? But for Zeus, immortality meant eternal vigilance, eternal fear, and eternal struggle. It meant that he could never truly rest or step away from his responsibilities. His immortality didn't make him invincible, it made him vulnerable, stuck in a web of decisions he could never truly escape. Zeus's immortality, in this sense, became a form of imprisonment. He was the ultimate ruler, but his power came with the endless weight of cosmic responsibility. There was no easy resolution to his story, no neat end to the battles he fought with his children, his rivals, or his own nature. Immortality, in the end, wasn't freedom, it was a trap. And this is the great irony of Zeus, the god who had it all, who ruled with supreme power, was ultimately trapped by his own eternal existence. He was forced to witness eternity, never able to escape the pull of time and destiny. And so, as we look back at Zeus's reign and his endless existence, we can't help but see him not as a figure of invulnerability, but as one of eternal struggle. He was powerful, yes, but his immortality came with a cost stone that no amount of thunderbolts or divine manipulation could ever ease. As we move further into the final chapters of Zeus's story, it's time to reflect on the more philosophical dimensions of his character. We've already seen that Zeus's reign was one of contradictions. He was the most powerful of the gods, yet deeply vulnerable. He ruled with authority, but at the same time, he was afraid of losing that power. He had control over the universe, but couldn't control his own fate. And, perhaps most poignantly, Zeus was a god who ruled over time, but was unable to escape it. And that's what makes Zeus such an endlessly compelling figure. His contradictions give us a glimpse into the very nature of what it means to be human. Though Zeus is a god, his struggle shares internal battles with power, legacy, and fear are what make him resonate with us. His story is not just about divine grandeur, it's about the universal experience of grappling with our own place in the world, with our own limitations, and the constant tension between what we can control and what lies beyond our grasp. Zeus's myth is ultimately a story of balance, the balance between the divine and the mortal, between the immortal and the transient, between strength and vulnerability. And nowhere is this balance more evident than in his relationship with mortality. For all his divine powers, Zeus couldn't escape the fact that every being, no matter how powerful, must eventually come to terms with their finite existence. Mortals, of course, face the inevitability of death, but gods like Zeus gods, who live for eternity, are forced to confront the impermanence of everything around them. His immortality did not give him the peace that might come with it. Instead, it bound him to a never-ending cycle of ruling, protecting, manipulating, and fearing what could eventually tear down the empire he worked so hard to build. Let's talk about how that eternal struggle manifested in his reign. As much as Zeus worked to maintain order, he couldn't stop the chaos that constantly surrounded him. Tyranny was ever present not only in the hearts of those who rebelled against him, but also within his own soul. Each time Zeus flexed his power, he was reminded that his reign wasn't guaranteed. Despite his control over the skies and the heavens, there were still forces beyond his reach, forces like fate and his own vulnerabilities. And that's why Zeus often turned to his children, because they embodied a different kind of power, one that Zeus couldn't quite control. Athena, born fully grown from his own mind, was a reminder that wisdom was a force beyond brute strength. Heracles, born from an affair that Zeus couldn't completely keep hidden, represented both the might of the gods and the messiness of their interactions with mortals. Then there's Apollo, whose control over prophecy reminded Zeus that no matter how much he tried to shape the world, the future was still a realm beyond his dominion. These children, in all their greatness and complexity, were as much a reflection of Zeus's own limitations as they were a testament to his legacy. Zeus may have tried to avoid the idea of his own fall, but his children were the living proof of change that would eventually come for him. They were the future, and no matter how much Zeus tried to manipulate or control them, they represented the inexorable flow of time and fate, forces that no god, not even Zeus, could escape. This brings us to another interesting element of Zeus's power, the way in which it was bound by the actions of others. Zeus, as the king of gods, could wield thunderbolts and direct the course of natural events, but when it came to the inner workings of the gods themselves, when it came to emotions, desires, and the messiness of family dynamics, Zeus was often powerless. The gods, like mortals, had their own desires, their own drives, and they often found themselves at odds with Zeus. And so, much of his rule was spent not in actual power, but in a constant negotiation with his fellow gods. He had to win their loyalty, keep them in check, and maintain their respect, even though they were just as immortal as he was, with their own motives and ambitions. Take, for example, the relationship between Zeus and Hera. Though they were married, their relationship was never easy. Hera, in many ways, was just as powerful as Zeus, and their struggles often became a battle of wills. Zeus's infidelity, his constant cheating, fueled Hera's rage and jealousy. Yet, they continued to rule together, each of them knowing that they couldn't hold Olympus without the other. Their relationship was a partnership of mutual necessity, even if it was fraught with tension. This leads to a final important point about Zeus, his relationship with control. We've seen how, despite his immense power, Zeus couldn't ever fully control his own destiny. He manipulated fate, sure, and he often sought to bend the world to his will. But in the end, Zeus was as much at the mercy of fate and time as anyone else. His immortality meant he couldn't escape the passing of time. While Zeus ruled over the heavens, he was constantly trying to preserve his legacy, protect his rule, and keep the gods in check. And yet, like every ruler, his story was ultimately bound to change. The gods may have eternal life, but their stories are not static. They change, evolve, and, like Zeus himself, they are shaped by the very forces they cannot control. The passing of time, the evolution of mortals, and the shifting dynamics of power, these things are part of what makes Zeus's story timeless. Even as the king of the gods, he was bound to the cycles of change, and that is what made him not just a ruler, but a symbol of the inevitability of change, of fate, and of the fact that no being, no matter how powerful, can escape time. Zeus's story is a paradox. He was the god of order, but his life was defined by constant turbulence. He was the king of the gods, but his reign was always in flux. And though Zeus may have believed he could control the universe, he was ultimately at the mercy of forces greater than himself. As we look back at the life of Zeus, we realize that his story is not just about a powerful god who ruled over the heavens. It's about the universal struggle to maintain control in a world that is constantly changing. And, in the end, perhaps that is Zeus's greatest legacy, that, like every other being in the universe, even he could never fully escape the forces of fate and time. And now, we arrive at the final chapter in our journey through Zeus's legendary, tumultuous, and sometimes tragic reign. By now, you've witnessed the full range of Zeus's power, from his dramatic victories to his profound struggles. We've explored his relationships, his manipulation of fate, and his eternal tension between ruling with divine strength and grappling with vulnerability. We've seen how his immortality, rather than being a gift, became both a burden and a source of internal conflict. But how does this grand story of divine power and cosmic balance end? The truth is, Zeus's myth doesn't conclude with some grand moment of closure or finality. There is no moment when Zeus, after all his trials and tribulations, finally sits back and relaxes, content with the world he has shaped. Rather, Zeus's story continues to echo through the ages because of the very nature of his reign. He is a ruler whose struggles never truly end. Even when he was at the height of his power, Zeus knew that one day, even he would be replaced by a new generation, by the inevitability of change. However, if we think about it, there is one important aspect of his myth that offers a quiet, almost philosophical resolution, the way Zeus becomes part of a larger cosmic cycle. The very world that Zeus struggled to control, he had to eventually acknowledge that, just like all the other gods, his time too would come to an end. The mythological tradition never provides a definitive end for Zeus, which is fitting because, in many ways, his existence mirrors the timeless cycles of the universe itself. Zeus, despite all his attempts at control, is ultimately a figure caught within the very forces he commands. This realization may be one of the most important aspects of his story. He never truly escapes the cycle of life and death, of beginnings and endings. The power he wields, both the destructive thunderbolts and the power to shape the cosmos, can never change the inevitable march of time. His reign isn't infinite because he is eternal. It's infinite because he is constantly in conflict with time itself. The gods of Mount Olympus, Zeus included, were eternal in a way that mortals could never understand. But that eternity was marked by change. The gods were not static beings. They experienced conflicts, emotions, betrayals, and victories just as mortals do. The universe, under Zeus's rule, wasn't a place of peace and stability, but rather a place of continuous struggle. And it was this constant battle between power, responsibility, fear, and the relentless march of time that defined Zeus's reign. In some ways, Zeus's ultimate legacy is a reminder to us all: we cannot control everything. No matter how powerful, wise, or influential we may be, the universe is filled with forces far beyond our comprehension or control. For Zeus, that meant dealing with the insecurity of his own reign, of knowing that he could not stop the tide of time, fate, or the actions of those around him. No matter how many thunderbolts he threw, no matter how many enemies he vanquished, the future would always remain uncertain. His power was real, but it was not absolute. He too had to face the same truths that mortals did. Perhaps the most human aspect of Zeus was his vulnerability. For all his divine attributes, he was never truly free. He was bound by his role as a ruler, constantly fearful of losing control. He couldn't keep his family in check forever. He couldn't maintain the balance he sought without resorting to manipulation or fear. And in the end, Zeus, like every mortal being before him, was subject to the forces of time, change, and the inevitable passage of history. But perhaps there is some comfort to be found in that. After all, if even the most powerful of gods has to face the limits of their existence, then it's not so bad for us to recognize the limits of our own lives and power. In the end, Zeus's legacy isn't one of perfect control, it's one of constant adaptation. His reign reminds us that even in a world full of uncertainty and change, we must navigate our paths with the wisdom we have, adapt to the circumstances we face, and accept that some things are simply beyond our reach. And in some ways, that makes Zeus not just the king of the gods, but a symbol of endurance in the face of inevitability. For all his failings, for all his power struggles, Zeus remained at the center of the divine cosmos for eternity. He had his flaws, but he was always present, constantly fighting, constantly trying to find balance. Perhaps his greatest lesson is this: even when it seems like the world is out of our control, we must continue to push forward, to adapt, and to live within the cycles of change. As we wrap up this tale of Zeus, remember, though his reign may not have had the kind of resolution that one might expect from a typical myth, it's the struggles he faced, the fears he fought, and the eternal cycles he navigated that made him more than just a mythic figure. They made him a reflection of life itself, an endless journey of growth, struggle, and ultimately, acceptance. So, while Zeus may never truly rest, his legacy endures not because he never failed, but because he kept going, day after day, year after year, adapting to the tides of change. His myth is timeless because it speaks to something deeply human, that we are all part of a larger story, one that unfolds regardless of our attempts to control it. And that, in the end, is the beauty of Zeus's tale.